good morning, and welcome to whatever this is going to be. Who can really say? We're going to be comparing, I think, probably our two favourite two tabletop games right now. We've got Middle-earth strategy battle game, the old favourite, and the new pretender, Star Wars Legion. It really came out of nowhere. I think I definitely was a bit dismissive at the beginning, but very much on board currently. And yeah, how are you feeling about them?
I would agree. We've been playing MESBG for a very long time,
Yep.
and it started to feel a little bit staler than it used to. And I think the new Star Wars Legion is quite exciting. New
Yep.
stuff's coming out. It's a different system, and we're certainly enjoying it at the moment. So
Yeah.
more time will be put into that, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think it's also got that new shiny feel that you really want with a game sometime, like all that new cool stuff that you can go out there and discover.
Yeah, it's the sort of game where you just buy 3 boxes of Magna Guard on a whim, and
We've all been there.
we've all been.
Okay, cool. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to try and give a very broad strokes overview of what's going on with these two games. This is by no means going to be comprehensive. We will miss stuff. We will oversimplify for the sake of brevity. If there is stuff that you think is wrong, you're probably right. And in order to explain it in enough detail, this would end up being sort of 3 hours long. So that's not quite how it's going to work. What we are going to do, though, is compare the two games, talk about what you could do to get started, what the basic game mechanics are, and if you enjoy one of them, why you might enjoy some aspect, if maybe not all, of the other one.
Yep. Sounds good.
Right. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to let Meh talk through the MESBG side of things on this one.
Right, so we've got list building and rules for MESBG. Rules are only officially available through GW Games Workshop rulebooks. As we know, they love to bring out new books every few years. Sometimes not even because they need new rules, just because they can. Generally, you'll need to spend £60 to £70 to get started with the rules and one of the army books. So that's a fairly expensive startup cost right there. List building tools are available online and are pretty functional. Tabletop Admiral, that's the wrong one.
No,
Be...
Tabletop Admiral does have one, and it's actually quite good.
Okay.
It's the one that I use to produce. I'll put it up now, but this one here, it is a bit niche, but it's actually not too bad.
Other list building
Tools
resources are available. We'd be wrong to not mention Lowly Knights spreadsheet. Really so yes, you can list build. There is not really a good official list building thing for this. Some online FAQs, but the versions can become slightly confusing, especially when after they've done the FAQ, they build the FAQ into the new rulebook, and then take the FAQs off the website. And then if you've still got the old rulebook, you can't see the FAQs anymore. So GW is not your friend when it comes to rules. It would be fair to say.
No, I think it is. I'm a big fan of SVG, stuck with it for a long time, but the FAQ does tend to cause a bit of rage and fury from even the most mild-mannered of SPG players every time it comes out.
It's not as bad as the other GW games like 40k. There's not a new rulebook every 2 years, so
that is quite a low bar, though.
Yeah, it's fair to say.
Yeah. Moving over to Legion, it's really different to SPG. There is no monetary aspect to obtaining the rules. It's all free online, and it's all updated for free online as well. So there is no paywall to accessing the points of models, the rules for models, the scenarios. All of that is available for free online. The other advantage to it all being available online is that it's very, very easy for the devs to update them as and when a new update or a balance is required. And I think that's something that is really good. And I think the SPG FAQ, that mixture of the physical rules and the online FAQ, is something that does lead to a bit of confusion, because there's also, which version of the FAQ are we using? Oh, it was like this in the old FAQ, not the new one. And then you have to trawl through to try and find which one is correct. The other thing I really like about Legion is the list building tools. I'm a big fan of 5th Troopers, Legion HQ, which I think is really nice. There is another one, the one that Crabot used in his videos, which also looks pretty good. I just marginally prefer the aesthetics of 5th Troopers, but they're both really good. So yeah, I don't know. Here it's interesting. Like, I think there is definitely an advantage to having a physical rulebook. Like, I do understand the appeal of that, but also for the longevity of the game, the advantage of just having an online resource seems really good. So yeah, not sure on that one.
They've sacrificed revenue essentially to make the game more appealing to people who maybe are a bit sick of having to buy rulebooks every few years, or codexes and supplements. And if I want that extra unit, it's in that one book, and I have to buy that now. And I know some people enjoy the books, but it's certainly a feather in the Star Wars Legion cap.
Yeah. I mean, I will say on the thing of like having a book, like there is definitely an appeal to that. Like, I still look through my old Watcher rulebook every now and again, and it does give you like a warm, fuzzy feeling sometimes. But it also makes you feel very sad when you realise in order to
use it.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is I've probably spent 150, 200 pounds on MESBG rulebooks over the years, and haven't spent a penny on Legion. So you know, that's always a positive. Yeah, it's a bit scary when you put numbers on things, isn't it? It's better to just live in denial. Anyway, moving on from that horrific realization. Let's talk about collecting. So, Mayor, as somebody who owns a pretty extensive collection of MESBG, how would you describe the collecting experience?
Infantry come in packs around 20, cavalry, along with more elite and specialized infantry in smaller packs. Heroes come in singles or twins. So straight away, that's fine, I think. Having around 20 infantry is good for most kind of scenarios. You don't want your heroes necessarily bundled with a load of stuff you don't want. The models coming in a mixture of hard plastic, metal, fine cast, and quote expert resin, I think is fine, but kind of a bit frustrating in some instances. Rowhammer or Guard looking at you. Discount retailers in the UK, you tend to buy from them because they're just cheaper. And the battle forces are generally good discounts, but they're not. GW rarely discounts properly unless it's in a starter box. So you're probably not going to see too much in the way of discounts on that. And generally, things are fairly expensive, especially the heroes when you look at the amount of plastic involved. And you're only getting a miniature, which isn't the same as Star Wars Legion, which I'll let you then go on to.
Yeah, so the difference with Legion is that rather than separating the purchasing of a unit and its rules, they've combined them together. So you get what's called unit cards that will come as part of any Legion model that you buy. They are a bit susceptible. Obviously, they need updating every now and again, so they're not perfect, but they are really nice. You get fewer models in a pack, it would be fair to say. So, for instance, for SPG, you spend 30 quid, you're probably going to get about 20 models. In Legion, if you spend sort of 20-ish quid, 25 quid maybe, you're probably going to get about 6 to 8 models. So you're getting a less value for your money, as it were. But they do tend to go a bit further in game. So there's sort of that aspect to it where you kind of need maybe fewer models for a Legion game.
You don't need 90 goblin miniatures.
Yeah, it's true. Although I'm not sure anybody really needs that. And then you get vehicles and heroes, either single or twin packs. You know, if there's a logical twin pack, like I don't know, Logray and Wicket, or Din Djarin and Grogu, they'll come together. But you also get like Han Solo by himself, Luke by himself, Vader by himself, whatever. There is a mixture of materials in Legion as well. There's the sort of softer plastic, which won't come on a sprue generally, and the harder plastic, which does. They're both fairly good in my opinion, but the harder plastic, which tends to be the newer stuff, does just have that bit more detail, which if you are a sort of high level painter, i.e. Sebastian, it does make a real difference. Again, really good discount retailers. I'm a big fan of Darkstar. They've done really well for me, always deliver on time and seem to offer really good discounts. They claim to always match the lowest price of any other retailer in the UK, so they should hypothetically always be the best deal. And actually, the other sort of parallel with SPG is they do also offer Battle Force boxes, which again offer a pretty good discount for people who are just starting out their collection. Yeah, I think in terms of collecting, I don't think either one has an edge. I think they're just different experiences. You're going to need more models for an SPG army, I would imagine. But I think the Legion models are slightly bigger, and I think just that slight increase in scale makes them that bit easier to paint. And as somebody who's not a particularly fine detail painter or anything like that, I do just find the Legion models a bit more friendly when I'm painting.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the Lord of the Rings models are really nice, but the Legion models just feel a bit more refined, and maybe that's partly to do with the limitations of being on screen, and we talked about it before with our is too much detail a bad thing? And I think it is in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people enjoy the sort of minutiae of, you know, these ridiculous 40k or fancy models or whatever that have all this tiny little bits of detail, but I can only speak from my own personal experience, not for people in general, but like I find that level of detail incredibly frustrating, and even if I paint all the detail correctly, it sometimes doesn't even look that good just because it is so small that it kind of all fades into a bit of a blur. But yeah, maybe that's just me. Okay, I think we need to talk about actually playing the game. So I'll take SPG and you can do Legion, but we'll switch it up a little bit. SPG, unless you're playing doubles, which is perfectly legit, but I don't think is as much of a thing.
Not really mainstream.
No. But you know, still perfectly valid. You're going to need the match play guide for tournaments and for scenarios in general. Comes with 18, I believe. And in general, the match play guide is going to be about 15 quid. Basically, you can pick scenarios in any way you want to. If you're playing a friendly game, you might pick one that's particularly thematic. In tournaments, either you're kind of given each one by the TO, the tournament organizer, each round, or it will be vetoed between sort of three possible options with you and your opponent. With SPG, it's nice because they are at a sort of more normal, in inverted commas, scale. A lot of terrain works really well for them. So on most normal boards, you'll see a lot of woodland. That's very common for SPG. Some sort of old castle or fortifications type stuff. Maybe a lake, or really just any kind of generic fancy terrain works pretty well. Board size normally 4 foot by 4 foot. That covers most game sizes. If it's a bit smaller, it might go down to 3 foot by 3 foot. Obviously, really big games, it might go that bit bigger, but in general, that tends to be about right.
Yeah, setting up the game for Legion then. In contrast, we've got a veto system from the battle deck of the blue player. So there's a very high number of possible combinations you've got to select from the scenario itself, the deployment, and then the condition. And there's going to be 4 of each of those selected by the player, but there are more in total. And that makes for a very large number of combinations. So it kind of keeps the gameplay fresh, and also allows you to select a little bit towards your own faction. So there's a bidding system. If you've got a lot less points than your opponents, or any less points than your opponents, then you use the cards that you've brought. So straight away you're at an advantage. And then the veto system kicks in, which allows your opponent to balance things slightly. If there's something that is particularly bad for their army, they can balance it. I know that a lot of tournaments have started doing that for SPG, where there's a veto system, but that doesn't always balance itself properly because the scenarios are so one-sided in some instances, looking at you, Goblin Town.
Yeah.
Then we've got terrain. sci-fi alien themed. Scale can be tricky because it's its own scale, 30 mil. But there are a lot of things you can do for Star Wars scenery that's quite exciting. Like because there's a lot of random toys available. Of course, you can go and buy a toy pretty cheap and cut it up and make it into scenery. There are interesting things you can do with that. Board size 4 foot by 6 foot for full scale games, or 3 by 3 for the smaller skirmish games, which makes it quite accessible. I would say that 4 by 6 is pretty standard, so anyone who's played sort of 40k will probably have something like that. And then 3 by 3 is a little bit more niche, but if you've got a 4 by 4 or really anything bigger than 3 by 3, which is pretty much every mat, you can just cordon off a corner of it or use electrical tape to make like a nice border.
Mm-hmm. And like sometimes that extra bit of space is actually quite nice because it means you've got space to put your models down, so it's no bad thing.
Especially when you've got all your cards for Legion. And all your tokens
it's
and
true. You really need that space. I don't know. Like, I think it's a complete cop out answer, but it's really up to you as to what you prefer. I think SBG is more controllable, and I think it's possible to learn the scenarios maybe a bit more. I think because Legion has such broad variety, and while yes, you may end up playing similar games, there might always just be that little nuance, even like dropping a minefield, or if you're not able to shoot beyond range 2 for the first couple of turns or something like that, does have an impact on the game. So it will keep things a bit fresh. It is noticeable actually for SBG that a lot of TOs, at least tournaments I'm going to, will throw in like extra little gimmicks to try and keep things fresh. And I do wonder if maybe that's a response to like people, almost learning these 18 scenarios kind of off by heart. Because, if you're an SBG player, think how many times you've played Lords of Battle or Hold Ground or whatever. Like, you do start to really rack up all those 18 scenarios pretty quickly. I think now, like a main overview of what the game is like. So for SBG, it's maybe a bit more standard, and I'm using the word standard a little bit carefully, but it's based around a D6 six-sided die, and use measuring tape to measure movement. You can also use 25 mil bases or something if you're trying to do things quite accurately, but yeah, that tends to be how it goes. For SBG, there are sort of phases, and we'll talk about these more in a minute, so I'm going to kind of gloss over it now, but I'll come back to it properly in a second. But basically, it's one person does their entire phase, and then the opposition player does their entire phase, and vice versa. It's not alternating model by model within that.
But it's also not quite as bad as 40k, where you literally do your move, shoot, and attack, and then your opponent does the same.
Yeah. And then if you're playing Tau, you take all your models off the board and you go home. See, I do know the 40k memes. I don't understand the game, but I do know the memes. The big thing in SBG is heroes, and I think this is one of the stronger aspects of the game because it does make heroes, which are central to the story, feel a lot more powerful by giving them what's called might, will, and fate. They let them influence dice rolls and sort of control activations a bit more. And when you see people talking about SBG, they'll often highlight heroes as the main reason they're taking a list. So that's a good aspect for me. In general, like a man-sized model would move 6 inches, dwarves move a bit less, hobbits move even less than that. And then you get cavalry and monsters and some Uruk-hai scouts or something who can move that bit further, a bit more maneuverable. A few models have a rule called Fly, which is very powerful, very maneuverable, but they do tend to pay a lot of points for access to that ability.
Yeah. In contrast, Legion plays more like a game like Bolt Action, where you, instead of having a whole round where you do all of a certain aspect, i.e. moving or shooting with your models, instead you go one at a time, backwards and forwards, using order tokens. Rather than doing all of your guys, it's a tit for tat, back and forth, 2 actions with a unit. You can do any number of select actions like moving, attacking, dodging, aiming. They all do different things in the game. And so you're not limited to having to do all of your movement first, for example, and then all of your attacking, like in SPG. But you can do 2 actions with your unit, then your opponent does 2 actions with a unit, and you go back and forth until you run out of units for the turn. and then you reset. You take all the orders back. I should say you're basically taking orders randomly from a pool of orders. There are ways to manipulate that, and you do issue orders at the beginning of every turn. There is some flexibility. Rather than rolling for priority like in SPG, you would pick is it an order card? Is that what it's called?
A command card, but yeah.
A command card. So you pick a command card, and depending on how many pips the card has, and you will have the same number as your opponent. If you have a lower number of pips, then you would go first. So there are ways to manipulate initiative in Star Wars that you can choose and plan for, rather than SPG, where your only option is essentially to do a heroic move, and then it's a dice roll. On a 4 I go, on a 1 to 3 you go, and that's always felt. It's led to a lot of feel bad moments in SPG. I feel, and in Star Wars, you're a bit more in control of that.
Mm-hmm.
Just rewinding a little bit to the dice, it uses an 8-sided dice for attack and a 6-sided dice for defense. You could technically use a standard 6-sided dice if you wanted to, but you would have to assign.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. You'd have to. That's not allowed. So basically, rather than SPG is designed for you to use basically any dice, and GW play into that by producing their own. But you don't have to use theirs. Whereas for Star Wars, you kind of have to use theirs. So they also have movement and range sticks rather than allowing for a tape measure. So I think where SPG you have to buy the rule books, in Legion you have to buy these things, but you're only ever going to need them once, and they often come in the starter sets, which are actually insane value. So you're ever going to need them once. Mm-hmm. Red dice are attack dice, and then black dice are red dice are the best attack dice. Then it's black, and then white. And the way that works is on the faces of the die there are lots of blanks. Well, lots of blanks for the white dice anyway. And you can have hits and you can have crits. Mm-hmm. The black dice are kind of the middling ones, and the red dice have the most hits and crits, and it just makes it more likely and creates more variation in units. For example, B1 battle droids are rubbish. They shoot white dice, and clones are great, so they shoot red dice. You've got different speeds. Or black dice. You've got different speeds, 3 being the fastest, and then speed 2, and then speed 1 being the slowest. And again, you use sticks for these. And they've got a pivot point in the middle, and if you had a vehicle you would have to go along that line, so you're sort of limited in the arc it can move, for example. Range can be infinite, but can be as low as quote range 1, which is roughly 6 inches.
So I think Legion creates, like, it's designed to be more simple in inverted commas, because you don't have to use tables. You just look at your unit card, and so, for instance, you know which dice you have to roll, and straight away you can see how many. And in the same way with the movement sticks, there's no element of like, can it fit through this gap? Is if the movement stick can go down and the model can move along it, it's fine. And I think it is designed to just be a bit less finicky, which, again, not good or bad, it's just different. And I think, I'm not saying the skill ceiling is different in both, but I think a lot of the skill in SPG comes in manipulating that minute detail, which maybe, while it does exist in Legion, definitely isn't as prevalent. With that in mind, I think we'll first talk about movement, and I think this is one of the biggest differences between the two. I think rather than talking through both individually, I'll kind of just like do an overview of what's going on. But so in SPG, the player with priority, which I'll explain in a second, goes first. They move all of their models, and then the opponent moves theirs. This can be disrupted with something called a heroic move. Now, this has to be done by a hero, and it requires they spend something called a might point, which most heroes will come with 1, 2, 3, or in some cases a lot more of. This would allow everyone in a 6-inch bubble to move a section of their army first, unless it was contested by another heroic move, and then it would go to a roll-off. Priority is decided by both players rolling a d6, and whoever gets highest has priority. If it's a draw, the player who lost priority last turn would get it this turn. So I think one of the big things with priority is you have no control, aside from a couple of specific characters, i.e. Saruman, over who wins priority. And I think, as Mary was hinting at earlier, that does lead to some feel bad moments because it's very swingy. For instance, if you've got like a cavalry army, getting like the charge with cavalry is really powerful, and you can sometimes win that just by the result of winning priority. And you will often hear players, even in casual tournaments, being like, "Oh, I lost 4 priority rolls in a row. What am I meant to do?" And like, I think that's a feel bad.
Yeah.
The other aspect to movement in SBG is you can literally move in any direction, and movement is hugely detailed because of the way, essentially, if you move within an inch of an enemy model, you have to charge it. You'll often see people having to measure out a sort of inch bubble around a model to make sure it doesn't move within it, so they don't have to charge it. And again, because the movement is so sort of detailed, that can suck up a lot of time and maybe isn't super engaging for your opponent to watch you sort of slowly plod your model around.
Yes, so moving on to the Legion movement, which is slightly contrast, but I suppose not too far away. I would just add to the SBG, I think there are so many niche rules as well that interact with scenery, whether you're having to jump over a piece of terrain or you're having to climb something or interact with water. There's a lot of detail to be found there, and then you add the complication of control zones, like you said, and it can become very bitty.
Yeah.
So movement in Star Wars is done using the movement tools. Units can move twice a turn, so you've got 2 actions, so you can move up to twice. You can move in any direction, but you have to use the tool. Vehicles are more limited. So vehicles have a notch in the front and back, which you have to use, and that's where the movement stick is mounted, and that means that your kind of arc of movement is more gradual as opposed to an infantryman who can just move in any direction at any time and spin on a dime. Once a model is engaged in combat, it cannot disengage unless it spends its entire turn to do so, which is a pretty big deal. You base, rather than in SBG where once combat's done, the next turn you can do something else with it. You have to basically sacrifice your whole turn to move out of combat. You can normally only trigger special abilities during your model's activation. So rather than in SBG where you've got a lot of passive rules, there are sort of passive rules in Star Wars, but you're going to have to more or less get out of combat to use them. So there's no we've separated from combat, so now if I win priority I can use magic before going into combat again. You're just stuck in combat until either you die or your opponent dies, unless one of you does something to get out of combat, like disengage using your entire turn, which does make combat a bit more sticky, but I would say the combat in Legion, the combat units, it's harder to get in, and also everyone's on a slightly more even footing in terms of melee than in SBG, because in SBG, one of you will win the combat and one of you will harm the opponent, whereas in Star Wars, you can hit each other regardless. It just depends who goes first, because obviously if you wipe out half your opponent's models before they get a chance to attack you, then they're only going to be attacking with half their models. So in that way, I suppose it feels a little bit more balanced, perhaps.
Yeah. And again, I think, like, so if you compare, the combat element of SPG to Legion, like, so in SPG, a model will enter combat with another model, and then that's their move done at least, but like that's only for that one turn. Whereas, as you're saying, Legion combat can last a couple more turns and is maybe slightly more impactful in that regard. Although obviously in SPG, like if you can just kill a model and then move on again, as we'll talk about in a second, like it does have that power as well. So yeah, again, just different, not strictly better or worse.
No, I would say. Sorry, go on.
I think SPG, there's more lethality in SPG. Maybe like I think you're much more likely to see a hero model, and we'll talk about heroic combats and all that shenanigans in a second. But like a hero could maybe do a lot more. Obviously, very powerful heroes in Legion as well, but I think it's just more commonplace in SPG to see those heroes tearing around and killing like multiple units a turn.
And I think with SPG, in the same way that a 50-50 roll off for who goes first can be a feel bad moment, it can also be a feel bad moment when your really big hero just completely whiffs his duel roll and you lose your duel to like a goblin. Whereas in Legion, you still get to swing if you're that hero. So you're never gonna whiff and then be like, oh shit, like my dice are rubbish. Sure, dice can be bad in Legion, but at least you get to roll them.
Yeah, and like I think at least in Legion you're always going to do like some amount of damage. Like if you're Luke going in with 7 black dice, even if you fluff completely, you'll probably do like a couple of wounds, which at least, as you're saying, does something. Okay, before we talk about combat, let's quickly do ranged attacks, because that's sort of the next phase in SBG. I've kind of done this in an SBG biased way, so movement, ranged, and then combat. If we talk about ranged attacks, I think a ranged weapon in SBG is significantly more of a luxury than it is in Star Wars Legion. Virtually every unit in the game in Star Wars Legion will have some kind of ranged weapon. It might be crap, but it will exist. Whereas in SPG, in normal armies, you can only have up to a third. Some can go up to 50% and occasionally 100%, but those are quite rare. In terms of like the relative power of shooting, I think there have been times in SPG, you know, Assault on Helm's Deep, that was a pretty much shooting focused list, but that was a bit of an outlier, I think. You know, there's like Rangers of Mirkwood and stuff like that, and Rangers of Athelion actually a while ago that was quite oppressive. I do think in general, people in SPG are quite averse to powerful shooting armies, because I think they are a bit of a feel bad to play against, because it just doesn't feel super interactive. And in terms of like the shooting power of a model, it's actually quite unlikely they'll get a wound. So you'll often hear things like honesty bows, just to make sure that, you know, if you've got a couple more bows than your opponent, they might have to come to you. But it's rarely like your strategy to win the game. Just in terms of like good versus evil, good can't shoot into combat, evil models can, but you have 50% chance of hitting your own model. So yeah, it's just a little difference between the factions. And normally you have about a 24-inch range, but some are a little bit shorter, and occasionally for some legendary legions you can shoot a little bit further. Whereas if we switch over to Legion, it's resolved in a similar way to a move action or a melee action, which we'll look at in a second. It has to be resolved during your activation, and it requires generally an action to do. So you'll just perform a ranged attack, and all you have to do is read out how many dice your model in that unit would shoot, and then you just roll that many dice shooting at your opponent.
Yeah, the ranged attacks can have a variety of special rules, which make them better or worse, and they have generally a much bigger impact in the game. I suppose because there's such a higher variation of ranged weapons, that there is also a higher variation of impactful special rules. Virtually every model in the game has a ranged option, as you said, but the power of these vary. So you're standing against your opponent is a much more even playing field. The variation of in SPG, I've got, you know, my strategy is basically shooting, or my strategy is to get into melee and therefore I have barely any shooting. It tends to be closer to one or the other, whereas in Star Wars Legion, it tends to be a much lower variation. Everyone tends to have shooting and or at least some kind of ranged threats. Even models that you would think are just melee, in some cases, they find a way to give them a ranged attack. You know, Yoda has like a force shockwave thing.
Force wave, I think it's called.
Force wave.
Force blast or something.
You know, no one else has that as far as I'm aware. But they obviously thought, you know what, we'll give Yoda some range. So, you know, maybe he's a bit. Is he move 2? Is he move 1?
Speed 1.
Speed 1. So he's pretty slow. So they obviously thought, well, let's give him some ranged threat, because otherwise everyone's going to know exactly how far he can move every turn. Whereas this way, he's got that extra threat range. So everyone has shooting it. And I think there's that is a nice to have, but I don't think it would work for SPG.
No, I think it would. I think it would fundamentally change the game. And like, I think it's also again down to the fact that in SPG, it's resolved in its own phase, and it's again, you shoot all your attacks, your opponent shoots all their attacks. And I think it would become a bit 40k like, where you just have this incredibly powerful shooting phase, and your objective is nothing to do with sort of the overall scheme of the game. It's just how many of my opponent's models can I take off the board so they don't get to shoot back. Whereas because in Legion it's alternating, you know, if you activate early and have a few shots, yes, you might try and kill one of your opponent's units, but in doing so, you might move yourself into a worse position, which means their units activating later would have a chance to kill you. So there's that sort of more of that alternating, you know, there's a punishment for maybe being a bit overly aggressive.
Yeah, it's true. It almost balances itself through the turn.
Yes. Yeah. Finally, let's talk about the sort of, is it the most controversial aspect of SPG? Maybe, I don't know. It's certainly the ones that I have the most debates about with my opponents. The combat phase. So again, this is in SPG, it's resolved in entirely its own phase. It is separate to all the others, and generally, what will happen is the player with priority will decide the order unless a hero declares a heroic combat, which would allow them to go first. Where this becomes really swingy is that if a player declares a heroic combat and is able to kill the model or models they're in combat with, they can then move out and move into a different combat. So people sometimes talk about like slingshotting around your opponent's army. And with some powerful heroes, it is definitely something that can win you games by itself. Like if you've got a big hero who's just tearing around and killing all of your guys, because they can do it multiple times a turn, it's extremely powerful. So this is definitely a big aspect of SPG that I think doesn't get replicated at all in Legion in sort of that aspect. The way melee is resolved is, as we mentioned earlier, the models will make a dual roll, and they'll roll as many dice as they have attacks. So generally, a basic infantry model will come with 1 attack. Some sort of more elite infantry or sort of lower end heroes will have 2. Then more powerful heroes, combat focus will have heroes will have 3. Then, you know, if you're on a horse, you'll get an extra attack. If you're very powerful, you might have 4 or 5 attacks, stuff like that. And basically all you do is you roll your dice, and whoever has the highest score wins. If it's a draw, the model with the highest fight value, which sort of represents how good a model is in combat, would win.
And the score is on a single die, not the total.
Yes, you don't add them together, or add your fight value, as we played for quite an extended period of time. Anyway, moving on. One day we'll get past that. Then what happens is, if you lose the dual roll, you're done. So you've nothing more to contribute for the rest of that turn. However, if you win, you then have an opportunity to kill your opponent. You roll as many attacks as you have to wound. And to work it out, you just compare your strength to your opponent's defense to work out the score needed to cause a wound. For instance, if you can get bonuses, so if you've got a two-handed weapon, you would deal, you're more likely to wound. If they're trapped or if they're knocked down, you get to double your number of attacks, which is very powerful. So it's why you'll often see mounted heroes or big monsters just going in and like absolutely destroying a sort of large group of models just because they have that power on the charge.
Yeah.
If we move over to Legion, in exactly the same way as all the other stuff, it's just another action as part of your activation. And I think similar to shooting, the differences with Star Wars Legion is that if you throw yourself into melee, especially early in the turn, you really do put yourself at risk of being surrounded by your opponent's other units and then getting killed. So it's not the case that that you can like win a melee, as it were, because even if you kill your opponent's unit, you still then leave yourself vulnerable for the rest of that turn. So there's definitely more of a payoff and sort of more vulnerability for a big hero charging in, because you can't just rely on rolling really hot to necessarily keep you alive for that turn.
So if you're in base contact with an enemy and have an action to spare, then they may make a melee attack. So some units have a rule where you can charge in and do an attack for free, but your opponent is mostly vulnerable to you just doing the attack against them, and then they would roll their defense dice based on how many hits and crits you do. And any wounds they don't save go through, and you remove models accordingly if they've got 1 wound, then they take a model off per wound. If they've got 2, then you do all the wounds to the 1 model until it dies and move on to the next. They can be improved by special keywords and abilities similar to SPG. So if you've got a rule like Pierce, then you might ignore a certain amount of your opponent's dice to make sure that you're doing consistent damage, in the same way that a lot of the ranged attacks have special rules. And it's a lot more varied, I would say, as well, than SPG tends to be.
Yeah. And like, I think one thing I neglected to mention earlier, actually, when I was talking about ranged attacks, is that when you roll your attacks and do a certain number of wounds, this goes for melee and ranged attacks, your opponent gets the opportunity to save against those wounds. So they would roll their defense die, and they would roll as many defense die as you've done wounds, again, unless they got a special rule or something. And for every one they save, they don't take a wound, and for every one that isn't saved, a wound would go through. You can mitigate this with things like cover. So cover's really effective in Legion for just making those ranged hits go away. Or you can use something called a dodge token, which again helps you just get rid of a wound for every dodge token you spend. So for me, and this is where I am actually going to come down on one side of the fence, is that I prefer the way Legion does it. The reason I prefer the way that Legion does both ranged and melee is that it feels more interactive. A big problem, I think, in SBG is that if you are going against an army that has a large number of bows or has significantly more powerful models than you in combat, you often just feel like a passenger sort of watching your army disintegrate in front of you. Like, they're rolling to wound, they're rolling to win the dual roll and then kill all your guys. And you often sit there being like, my army's dying and there's nothing I can do to prevent it. Now, that might be your fault for building a bad list, but I think it's also maybe the way that the game is constructed that it does just have those turns where you just sit there and you really don't do anything. And even for movement as well, actually, like, I increasingly find myself walking away from the table when my opponent's doing their move, because I'm just like, I can't really be bothered to watch this. Like, I trust them to do it properly, and it's not hugely interesting for me because I'm not doing anything here. Whereas in Legion, purely because of those alternating activations, and maybe this is just me having a short attention span, it always feels like you're about to do something and that you're planning. And like, you know, if you get attacked, it's not just you look up the wound table and see whether you've been wounded. It's, do I spend a dodge token? It's, do I try and activate deflect with my Jedi? How many defense die do I need to roll? Do I have any special abilities that work with this? Can I use like Guardian to try and protect my hero with some surrounding units? Like, you have these decisions to make. And even if in the grand scheme of the game, maybe it won't be super impactful, it does feel like at least you are part of the process. And I think that's why I marginally prefer sort of the feeling of Legion.
It's a good thing you don't play 40k. That's all.
Yes, I think I've been very lucky to not get hooked on that particular drug. Yeah.
And that brings us on to winning the game.
Yeah, which is obviously the ultimate objective of playing anything. So
I feel somewhat qualified to make. I think you should do the Legion one on this one, because
you do SPG because you do a lot more. You do a lot more winning in SPG than I do.
It would be fair to say you do a lot more winning in Star Wars than I do.
Yeah.
So winning the game, generally based on achieving 3 objectives, depending on the scenario: controlling parts of the board, moving a prize, killing your opponent, etc. Can also depend on specific models like leaders or banners. They tend to be more common, or breaking. There's no set turn limit, and can often last 10 plus turns at least. Generally ends when someone has a very small amount of their army left, or run out of real life time. There are, as OT mentioned before, 18 different scenarios, and it is fairly easy to build your list around trying to be good at least most of those. Yes, so that's a fair point. You're generally fighting over a primary objective, and then there are the tertiary objectives. The primary is usually something like finding the prize. Sometimes it can be killing your opponents, but often it is objective based, and there are often 4 to 6 objectives around the board that you need to try and control, which often leads to armies with a medium to large number of models doing quite well in the majority of scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think while like all hero lists are definitely cool in SBG, unless you're really good at the game, they're extremely difficult to do well with. One of the lists that quite prevalent at the moment, Black Riders, so the Nazgul, is, I think, a very powerful list, but is extremely difficult to win scenarios with because you don't have many models, and because you largely rely on not necessarily like being in combat and killing models, but kind of like controlling your opponent, which I think is really tricky to do for less experienced players.
Yeah, there's no way to manipulate the scenario for your list. You know that you're going to have to play some scenarios that will not suit your list if you have a very small number of models.
Yeah. If you flip over to Legion, again, this is sort of the choice aspect. Because while the veto is not necessarily the be all and end all, it is very impactful as to what kind of game you're going to play. And you can definitely, during the veto, prioritize stuff that you know will be very difficult for your list to do. And I think that's a really nice aspect, because I think it almost, again, balances itself, because you and your opponent are both trying to optimize it as well as possible for your own list. And hopefully most of the time that produces a fairly balanced game. In SBG, you often get given a scenario where you're like, this is not possible. Like, this is virtually always an instant loss. And again, that might be your fault for building a list in certain ways, but I feel like that's maybe less likely to happen in Legion. The one similarity for sure is that they often, the Legion scenarios rely on very similar things. So it might be controlling parts of the board, it might be killing your opponent's models, it might be grabbing a prize in the center and trying to run off with it. There's also hostages exchange and things like that. What you can do in Legion, though, that's quite neat is you can win additional points by getting what are called bounty kills. So that's with a bounty hunter. If you kill your target, you'll get a little token that gives you an extra victory point at the end of the game, which can be very impactful. There's also units like R2 and Amidala that have like secret missions and enable you to get an extra couple of points if you had those in your list. The other difference is the hard turn limit at 6 turns, and that's a full scale. It's 5 turns for the smaller skirmish format. What I will say is the tournament I went to, in none of the games did I get past 4 turns. In fact, one of them I only managed 2. Legion definitely is, especially at the beginning, a lot to go through. Like, you have a lot of decisions to make. And because you're both doing that and you're both reacting to what your opponent does each time, it does mean that the game can tend to stretch out a little bit longer. So yeah, I think maybe SPG is more efficient just because it's one person does something, the other person does something, but maybe that's not necessarily better.
Yes, I think I tend to agree. I'm looking forward to actually winning Legion one day. I'll manage it.
I don't think that day's that far away.
We'll see. But yeah, I think we're both quite excited to play a bit of Legion. It's quite refreshing.
Yeah.
I think some of the balance aspects are a lot more engaging, and you do always feel like there's something to do. There's something to look at. There's ways to play around with your list in a much more customized way than in SBG as well.
Yeah, like a hero can kind of perform multiple different roles depending on the upgrades you give them, and that's really nice because, like, take a hero. I mean, this isn't a great example. I'm going to trigger quite a few people here, but I can't think of a better one, so just roll with it. If you took, say, Din Djarin, and you could kit him out either as more of a like skirmishing unit, like a mid-range threat, like trying to snipe off your opponent's models and stuff, or you can kit him out full melee and just try and chuck him in and hope for the best. And those are both like fairly valid. Obviously, Din not super competitive, but that's like an example of ways you can equip units differently to try and get them to perform different roles.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it also means you're almost getting more than one unit in that box. You know, you can run them multiple ways. I also like the upgrade card kind of hunting that you have to do. Well, I like it and dislike it. I don't think it's good that you have to buy certain kits to get certain cards, but there isn't a lot of rules breaking if you were to just print them off.
Yeah, I think it'd be fine. Okay, so that's kind of the end. I think just kind of like maybe we'll spin through a quick conclusion and then we'll finish it up there. But if you had to compare the two right now, what are your sort of instincts if you were comparing the two?
Well, I don't know if it's because I've just played SBG for a very long time, but it's sort of begun to feel a bit more like a simple game, or like a simple game that could be improved. And while I'm not saying that Star Wars Legion can't be improved by any means, but I think some of the mechanics feel a lot fairer. I haven't necessarily experienced any of that yet because all my games have been against you. So, or all my recent games. I really need to play against Onod, and then at least one of us can win a game. But
I reckon you'll draw.
Yeah, I think so. My instinct is just that I'm very excited to play Legion, and I can't quite put my finger on why. I just think that maybe it is the shiny new feel, and I think that's okay as well.
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it's actually one of the things that I think is most heavily in favour of Legion is that while Atomic Mass Games (AMG) aren't necessarily throwing everything at it, they've got other projects going on. There is at least dialogue around the game. There are releases coming out. Like there is this feeling that it will continue. Whereas I think SBG for a while has felt like it's not like hanging on. That's not fair, but it's kind of been on the back burner for Games Workshop. Like they churn out a shitty community announcement every now and again that some intern wrote in about 20 minutes,
if
that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but all I'm saying is it doesn't feel like there is the sort of care for the game that maybe is being thrown at Legion right now. Like, and to be fair to Games Workshop, like what they've produced for Lord of the Rings is fantastic. Like it's a very good game, and I don't think it actually needs anything else. What I would say though is this current attitude they have of kind of dangling things out there, be like, oh, look how cool this is, and then being like, oh, actually no, it's just crap. Like we've made a diorama with maybe one model you could actually use on the board. And similarly with the
recast the same miniatures in a different material.
There's nothing wrong with that, is the point, but don't expect people to get excited about it, and it's not a reason for people to stick with the game, which I feel is kind of what they're going for. So yeah, that is an increasingly important aspect for me. But yeah, I think it's also just the shiny new aspect, and I think I can understand why you especially would be a bit jaded by SBG because you've played a lot of it over the last couple of years, and I think you have kind of reached a point, especially with Goblin Town, where like the scenarios, a lot of matchups, so you can just kind of autopilot through.
I can almost predict like a lot of the games.
Yeah.
I can predict the outcome before I finish playing it, or before I've even started playing.
Yeah, and I think you could also point to the board and be like, there'll be a fight here, there'll be a fight here, there'll be a fight here, and those are the only ones that are relevant because they're near the objectives. And if I roll well in those, I'll win the game. If I don't roll so well, I'll lose the game. And that's kind of it. I think one thing that I enjoyed with SPG is I'm increasingly taking sort of lists that are maybe a bit different to what I've done before. So last tournament I went to, I took Eagles and Thorin's Company, which I'd never played before, and actually really enjoyed it. Like completely different to the dwarf list that I've normally taken. And, maybe that's why I'm actually looking for, just that sort of shiny new feel.
You did really well with it too.
It went all right. It went all right. Surprised myself, despite the max fixing allegations. Cool. Right. Well, I think that'll do. Yeah. Tell us your thoughts. Why are we wrong? Why should I be playing 40k right now? Yeah. But yeah, what do you think? What do you all think? Do you think SBG is the future? Is Legion the future? Are we all going to be playing Shatterpoint? Should we all go back to X? Should we all go back to X-wing? What are these questions? I don't have the answers to. But cool. That's it from me. I've been joined by the mayor.
Hello.
And goodbye. Yeah, nailed it. And yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.